Well, hello and good evening. Thank you for joining us, everyone. My name is Sam. I'm one of the co-owners of the Norwich Bookstore, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I appear to be plagued by unknown audio gremlins tonight, so I apologize if my voice has some reverb attached to it. I'm going to make my remarks short. But tonight I am delighted to be here with Elizabeth Emerson and Carol Henderson talking about Letters from Red Farm. This is a new book. Get it out of the glare there. Letters from Red Farm. This is a new book from UMass Press. It is an untold story of New England history and an untold chapter in the Helen Keller story. We're very, very excited to be welcoming Elizabeth Emerson to talk about it. You can buy this book. It is out in the world now, and we are going to post links to purchase this book from the Norwich Bookstore in the chat, so you'll see those coming up. We encourage you, if you haven't picked up your copy of this book, to do so, and we would love to ship one to you wherever you are in the country, or if you're here in the Upper Valley, have the book available for pickup at our store. And thank you for supporting local and regional authors, local and regional subjects, and supporting our bookstore. Tonight, we're going to do some Q&A after the event. You can drop your questions either into the chat or into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a module that says Q&A. You can click on that, type in your question, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the event. And again, I'll post a reminder for that in the chat. And if you would like to see other events with us, we are doing a full schedule of author events from here up until the holidays, and we'll resume again in the new year. So we encourage you to go onto our website, norwichbookstore.com, and check out our event schedule, or you can follow us on social media, and we do post about our many events upcoming there. Many of our events are virtual right now, but in the future, we will also be doing live events when it's safe to do so. So we hope to see you at another Norwich Bookstore author event. And now, without further ado, I am thrilled to welcome Elizabeth Emerson. Elizabeth Emerson is a former grant writer and an award-winning artist based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She has contributed material to PBS's film biography, Becoming Helen Keller, and written guest articles for the American Foundation for the Blind's Helen Keller Archival Collection and for the Perkins Archive newsletter. Her new book is Letters from Red Farm. And joining Elizabeth Emerson tonight in conversation is Carol Henderson. She is an author, an editor, and a teacher living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Please, wherever you're joining us tonight, join me in giving a warm Upper Valley welcome to Carol Henderson and Elizabeth Emerson. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I'm Carol Henderson, and I'm an author and a workshop leader and teacher living in Chapel Hill. As Sam said, if you want to know anything about me, just go to carolhenderson.com. We're here tonight to talk about Betsy's book. I first met Betsy in 2012 when she joined a creative nonfiction writing workshop I was offering. She was working on a memoir, which we're all hoping she will go back to now after this book. And she was also doing some research, she'll tell you a lot more about that, on the relationship between her great-great-grandfather and Helen Keller. She was unearthing letters and different materials, and she said to me, could I possibly read some of this material because I'm finding it really compelling? And we said, sure, yeah. I mean, it's a memoir course, but bring in what you're finding. So she started reading what she was finding, and we were all enthralled. And so I am very happy to have been a part of a listener for many years of so many of these absolutely fabulous letters. And I'm just really impressed with how beautifully this book has turned out and how Betsy has created just a really dramatic and lively narrative in the voices of the people themselves. But I want to turn it over to you now, Betsy, so that you can tell us a little bit about Letters from Red Farm, the untold story of the friendship between Helen Keller and journalist Joseph Edgar Chamberlin. So get us started, Betsy. We're so happy to be here.
Thank you, Carol and Sam. It's very exciting to be here. I especially want to thank Sam for taking such an immediate and early interest in this book. I contacted him this summer, told him the book was coming out and that I thought it would have a lot of appeal to people living in the Vermont, New Hampshire, Upper Valley area. And he immediately got back in touch with me, which was just so nice and encouraging. And that was, again, a few months before the book came out. So it's just wonderful to be here. I'm excited. I got my copy yesterday from Norwich Bookstore. It was my first contact with the actual book after working so many years on this, the research and the writing and then the editing and just the, the road to publication through UMass Press, who has just been wonderful to work with. So here we are tonight, and this is my first book talk, so I'm a little nervous. I apologize, but I am really excited. This is a story that just captivated me, and when I brought it to Carol's group of listeners, it seemed to captivate them, so that really motivated me to keep going. And it's been just a labor of love, but a wonderful experience. It was sort of a writer's dream to encounter these two people, Helen Keller and Joseph Edgar Chamberlin, who went actually by Ed, and their friendship and their affection for one another. So I'm excited to be sharing it with the world. To tell you a little bit about it, I have some notes that I'll use early on so I don't ramble or forget something. But Letters from Red Farm tells the story of the 40-year friendship between Helen Keller and Joseph Edgar Chamberlin. They met in Boston when Helen was 8 years old. So this would have been about 1888. And Ed was almost 40 years old at the time and was already a prominent journalist and writer in the Boston area. And Helen had come to Boston to attend school at the Perkins Institution with her teacher, Annie Sullivan. And Annie Sullivan was actually a graduate of the Perkins Institution and had gone to Alabama to work with Helen Keller. So by the time Helen met Ed Chamberlin in 1888, and she was 8 years old, she was already famous because her story was being broadly broadcast by the Perkins School. Helen was this charming child with multiple disabilities whose story just captivated people, and she was, sort of already being stalked by newspaper reporters, and her story was widely known. And Ed, meanwhile, was a beloved newspaper journalist who had a daily column in the Boston Transcript, and his byline was "The Listener." And so he wrote this daily column. It was just observations of nature, life in the town, humanity. He could really write on any subject that he chose. And so every day, genteel New England waited for Ed Chamberlin or the Listener's column. And he also was an editor at the same time for a national magazine called Youth's Companion. So not only was he, putting his own thoughts out there, but he was also really, editing and choosing major writers such as Mark Twain and Emily Dickinson to appear in this national magazine, and really sort of was making unknown writers at the time, nurturing their careers and selecting them for inclusion in this magazine. So he had an influential role, and also could steer public opinion through his own column. So soon after meeting Helen, Ed invited her and Annie Sullivan to visit his home, which was called Red Farm in the village of Wrentham, which was outside of Boston, about 25 miles. And Ed lived there with his wife, Ida, and their 5 children, one of whom was his daughter, Elizabeth, who was almost the same age as Helen, just a few years older. Elizabeth, would eventually become my great-grandmother. But going to Red Farm gave Helen the opportunity to play, to be a child, away from a school setting, which is where she spent most of her time when she was in Boston at the school. So she could go to Red Farm and she could just play with other children, lead a normal life, be outdoors. And the same was true really for Annie Sullivan, who had no home. She was an orphan. And so the two of them, Annie, who at the time was, I believe, she would have been about 18 or 19, could be wrong, I'll have to check my timeline, and Helen, who was 8 years old. So, but the thing about Red Farm was it was this mix. It was a rural working farm out in the country, but it also was on the shores of this lake that was at the time called King Philip's Pond. And so you could participate in farming activities, or you could go down to the water's edge and row around the lake or swim. So it was this sort of intoxicating mix of opportunities for anyone who visited. It was also a gathering place, and Ed Chamberlin was a known editor, a well-known editor. He apparently was a very nurturing person professionally and personally. And so Red Farm attracted this circle of nationally known writers, theologians, social reformers, artists, writers, and musicians. And it created this atmosphere of, creativity and acceptance, and also really dialogue and opportunity to advance. Poets who were unknown could bring their poems and read them to this gathered group and get feedback, sort of like Carol's writing group. And it really, as you'll see in the book, it was a safe place to be liberal, progressive, and even radical and eccentric. It was sort of all types of people, a diverse crowd, not in any way, this staid, proper crowd of people. So I guess to sum it up at this point, Ed Chamberlin was a very unusual man for his times. And he was modest. He did not seek the limelight for himself. So he gathered these people around him, including Helen and Annie, and just created an atmosphere where everyone could be themselves. He was also a strong advocate on social issues. I'll talk about in a minute what his background was. And he spoke up frequently about Helen and her her potential and the need for her to be educated formally. And Helen, meanwhile, credited him with what she called her education in literary ways. And I think in the book, I say later on years later, when Helen was older, she said it was only when she met Ed Chamberlin that her education in literary ways began. So they wrote often about each other in newspapers and magazines over the years. But I think the overriding thing that to say is that they just adored each other. For over 40 years, they adored each other. And I have one little excerpt I'll read. It's in the front of the book. And it's that sort of captured quote where Helen says, "I wish you knew Mr. Chamberlin better. I think you would find much to admire in his character. He runs through life's maze of joys and woes so peacefully and with such kindliness towards all living things that one cannot be with him and not feel something of his gentle influence." And she wrote that to a friend in 1898. So that's a little introduction to the book. I hope I didn't ramble on too much.
No, that was fascinating, Betsy. And just for the circumstances of this reading up in Vermont, there are some Vermont connections in particular that people might find interesting. Do you want to talk about those for a minute?
So they're dealt with in detail in the book, but in general, I guess what I can say is that Ed was born in Newbury, Vermont. and to a family that had settled there in 1762. The Chamberlins were one of the first families to arrive in Newbury, and all of his ancestors are buried in the Newbury Cemetery, you know, these old slate markers. That's where Ed's roots were. But in let me check my date here, 1857, when Ed was 6, his parents moved to Wisconsin. And you can sort of picture the little house in the big woods, and it was about that same time. So the Chamberlin family moved from Vermont to Wisconsin and tried to eke out a living farming in this new territory. And I think it was a very hard existence, but apparently they felt like it was going to be more of an opportunity than they were finding in Vermont as farmers. And so they moved west. But the family never really left Vermont behind completely. It's really important to know that Ed's parents were abolitionists, and they were staunch and vocal abolitionists. It's highly likely that they were they participated in the Underground Railroad back in Vermont, and then also in Wisconsin when they arrived there. So that's discussed in the book. When Ed he was the youngest of 10 surviving children. And when Ed was born, his oldest sister was 24 years old. So that says so much about women's lives, I think, back in the 1850s. And at 17, after attending the local schoolhouse for his education, Ed's family did not have the resources for him to go to college. And so he, as he said in his autobiography, he was bitterly disappointed. But his older brother, who was already working in Chicago as a journalist, sort of gave him entree to the newspaper there. And Ed moved to Chicago and began working as a copy holder at a newspaper, and from there worked his way up to cub reporter. And he really, his name became very well known when he was one of the first reporters on the scene of the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. And after that, so his reports were some of the first to go out to the world. And after that, his name was really well known. And so it established him in the newspaper field. And he worked his way up from there to managing positions at specifically at the Chicago Times by the time he was in his late 20s. And he also had married Ida Chamberlin, who was also from a Vermont family. And he was working for a newspaper that had a Vermont-born owner. So it seems like the Vermonters all found each other out there in Chicago, and somehow, it was a bond that that kept them all together. Ida, I don't know. It's interesting how many people both left Vermont at the time, and also how many gathered there. They found each other in Vermont. So that's detailed a lot in the book and talked about. And then after suffering what was described in his biography as a nervous breakdown, Ed returned to the East Coast in 1880 and settled in Boston after stints at several newspapers in New England. But he always took on literary roles. No, he never again took on a managerial role at a newspaper. And the family, after returning to Boston, ended up frequently on vacations in Vermont. So it was this magnet that drew them back. And in the end, Ed and his wife, Ida, are both buried in Vermont. So it just, Vermont plays a huge role in their lives, as you'll see in the story. Even though he spent most of his working career elsewhere, Vermont was where they returned to.
So Betsy, let me ask you, tell us, okay, these are your great grandparents. Tell us about your relationship to this story and how you came to discover it.
Well, okay. Yeah, I didn't grow up knowing this story. I mean, I knew that Helen had, known them as a child. But I guess, let me just, is it okay if I read the preface?
Absolutely, please do.
I've condensed it a little bit because it really is the story of finding this story and just one thing leading to another. So I'll read that. I did want to say really quickly that also, in addition to Vermont, there's a New Hampshire connection because Laura Bridgman, who was the first deafblind girl to be formally educated, and specifically at the Perkins Institution, was from Hanover, New Hampshire. And she was born there. I believe she's buried there. And so even before Helen Keller, Laura Bridgman was sort of the poster child for deafblind education at Perkins. And in fact, Charles Dickens wrote about her, and that's how the Keller family knew or came to know that Helen could possibly be educated. So let me read the preface. Let me get a sip of water real quick. As it turns out, our family's best memory keeper was a deafblind girl named Helen Keller. I grew up fascinated by books about Helen Keller. I was captivated by the story of the wild child, as people called her, who could neither see nor hear, and whose inner potential and delightful personality were revealed by her teacher, Annie Sullivan. While millions around the world also read those stories, I had a unique and personal relationship to them. Books about Helen frequently mentioned times she spent with a family named Chamberlin at their home called Red Farm in Wrentham, a suburb of Boston. As I read, I knew that she had spent those hours with my great-great-grandparents, Joseph Edgar, or Ed, and Ida Chamberlin and their children. The fact that Helen spent parts of her childhood with my ancestors was the extent of my knowledge of the relationships until a few years ago, when I came across copies of 2 letters that had been passed down to me through 4 generations of my family. One was the letter of sympathy that Helen wrote in 1935 on hearing that her Uncle Ed had passed away. The other Helen had written to Ed a year earlier, a long and intimate document that illustrated a lengthy history and close relationship of more than 40 years. It was clear that not only were they friends, but the bond between them was deep and lifelong. And like many friendships, theirs appeared to have weathered good times and tumultuous times. I felt compelled to find out more. My research started in earnest in January 2012 when I called the American Foundation for the Blind, or the AFB, in New York City, where most of Helen Keller's personal letters and papers are archived. From an online search, I knew there existed a box of letters related to the Chamberlins in their collection. I reached Helen Selsdon, the head archivist at the AFB. I began by telling her that I was the great-great-granddaughter of Joseph Edgar Chamberlin, a man who had been a journalist in the Boston area and friends with Helen Keller for many years, and I was interested in doing some research. I could hear the phone being jostled, repositioned. Say that again? I repeated my story. Oh my goodness, Miss Selsdon said, the Chamberlins were huge in Helen's life. It's so amazing to hear from you. Are you really of the family? She was eager to help me. 5 days later, I received a 20-page list of hits in the Foundation database that involved the Chamberlins. It was immediately obvious from the entries that the narrative revealed would not be the one I had expected. Somehow I had imagined I would discover a pleasant, straightforward tale about my friendly family who invited Helen and Annie for dinners and holidays at their home. Instead, what I found was a complex and multi-layered story that told of joys and talents, but also of controversy, tragedy, and personal and systemic failings. It was clear that I had something bigger on my hands than merely a collection of family anecdotes. So 6 months after that, I visited the AFB in New York, and I was greeted by Helen, who was just, Helen Selsdon is an amazing person, full of energy, extremely generous, wanting everybody to know about Helen and the work that the AFB does as far as maintaining her personal letters. So she loaded my arms with these boxes of letters and showed me to a place where I could sit to read them. And so I sat down in this little cubicle, and the first letter was a letter from Ed to Helen. And so for the first time, if you can imagine, I'm seeing the handwriting of my great-great-grandfather, a man I never knew, a man who my family really didn't talk about. But here he is, and it felt like the handwriting was, like making him come alive. And so he was writing to Helen, and he said he was obviously well acquainted with her, and he was asking for her to write a little story for him. And he said, "You know me, I do not want a long story." And so that was the first letter and the first connection with Helen. And those letters were the perfect starting point, going through them and reading them. But then one thing, it seemed like every letter or every little unclosed little thread led to something else, and including the Alexander Graham Bell family papers at the Library of Congress. Just so many archives of letters from the artists and writers who gathered at Red Farm. But also, as a journalist, Ed Chamberlin left a long trail of his own, and I was fortunate to have access to his autobiography covering his first 18 years, and also a brief biography written by a man named Samuel M. Waxman, which appeared posthumously in the Boston Evening Transcript anthology of his columns. And then there were other online searches, revealed magazine articles. By now, several of his books are in the public domain and accessible. So I found information in so many places, but really the writer who tells us the most about Ed Chamberlin is Helen Keller. And she was a prolific and generous letter writer herself. She was really the primary communicator for Annie Sullivan, because Annie, was understandably tired after teaching and working with Helen each day. And also had troubles with her eyes. And so Helen became the primary letter writer for the two of them, which, is actually our good fortune, because we have Helen's words to tell the story in so many ways. And so these were two people who found each other, Helen Keller and Ed Chamberlin, and they were very sympathetic souls in a lot of ways. They were writers. And so the book is really their story based on those letters and that relationship.
Yeah, well, and when you read this book, you just won't believe the beauty of the relationship and of the writing of Helen Keller's writing. I know we all know that she wrote very well, but there was just something so tender and extraordinary in her relationship and her writings with, as she called him, Uncle Ed, and his to her and his support of her through so many trials. And boy, did she have trials, being such a young celebrity. Same kinds of issues and trials that celebrities face today. I found that an interesting aspect of the story. So you get this sort of overlay of these letters between Helen and Ed, and then these antagonists who go after her, and Ed defends her. I mean, it's really a very captivating narrative with an enormous drive to it. In the beginning, we were just hearing these long, long letters and wondering, how is this going to work? But Betsy managed to just capture what was really essential in these letters and in these relationships, so that literally I was on the edge of my seat reading this book, concerned about the future of Annie and Helen and Ed's travails, and so many of the people of the times, and how they kind of tried tried to come in and take over and own Ellen. It was kind of like they were sharks, a lot of them going after her. And Betsy does a really beautiful job of showing all of them, and in their own words, they're fighting over this young, amazing woman. So I want to ask you now, Betsy, for what is unique about this book for people who think they know the Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, most people that I encounter immediately think of the miracle worker, and, the moment when Helen discovers language at the water pump, when her teacher has been trying to communicate with her using sign language, and Helen is just not getting it. And she's, her behavior is atrocious. She's even sort of dangerous to her baby sister. She's just really, the poor girl is just floundering, unable to communicate. So people know that aspect of her life, and some people know, that she as she grew, she went to Radcliffe and she became very outspoken on a number of issues. But I feel like this book makes Helen, shows her as a very multidimensional person with struggles and likes and dislikes, and just told in her own words her relationship with the world and with people. So it's a much broader and more intimate view of Helen. It's Helen in the context of a friendship. There are so many books written about her that sort of tell the story of her life, but this is really specifically in the context of a friendship with a person who was really her mentor, and who she adored. It illuminates the many challenges she faced in trying to pursue an education, and as you mentioned, the high price of celebrity. I think we see that today with young, precocious actors, actresses, for example, who are just, hounded and stalked constantly and really can't have a normal life. And in some ways, Helen, it was a similar situation for her. And also, if you're interested in disabilities history and education, this is really a historical snapshot of the times that Helen was living in. But it also, the book introduces Ed Chamberlin to a modern public. At the time he was well known and beloved, but he's been really lost to history. Nobody knows who he is now. And so as Helen said, she wished people knew him better. And so the book really does that. But also, it was a search for me, what was it about this man that Helen loved so much? And also, like, even I asked myself some just simpler questions, like, what would it have been like for your father to bring Helen Keller home? She was, everybody knew who she was. And, what if your father came home one day and said, this little deaf blind girl is going to come tomorrow with her teacher to play with you? What would that have been like? And then, of course, we all sort of wonder what our ancestors' lives were really like. And so this is a social portrait in many ways of people of the times. And I also, there are all these sort of overarching contextual themes, the history of journalism and what the journalism world was like between 1871 and 1935, when Ed, was involved with it. And so there's a lot of, he comes in contact with so many people and names that would be familiar to people today. Mark Twain is, in this, Alexander Graham Bell, as I mentioned before, who wasn't a journalist, but, these names, Rube Goldberg was a colleague. And So anyways, it was the golden age of newspapers. So I think that's worth mentioning. And the story, the 40 years, it really follows Helen's growing interest in social issues and her just, deepening advocacy for the issues that she cared about, as well as Ed's too. I mean, she was sort of, she learned at his knee about social engagement and advocacy, and that you can change things that are wrong in society.
Yeah, she would. We would all wish for an Uncle Ed. I just have been, I'm so happy to have discovered him through this book and your work on him. I mean, I just developed a huge crush on this man. He's just so utterly divine. He knows everything about nature and just, any subject, history, and he shared all this with Helen, and you see her learning from him, and you see how just, patient and humble and kind he was, and helpful to her. And so it's a really extraordinary portrait of a lot of different people, and of a cultural period, and of the age of the newspaper. And so I think, is there anything else that you want to talk about before we, any other writers who, I was thinking about the Harvard graduate.
Yeah. So I think it's, so I know you're talking about Haben Girma, who is the first deafblind graduate of Harvard Law School. And she is a contemporary, a deafblind woman who is, sadly, has experienced a lot of the same barriers to education that Helen over 100 years ago faced. And so I think that even though this story took place over 100 years ago, it's still surprisingly contemporary. I mean, it shouldn't be that way, but it is, that people with disabilities are still struggling with attitudes that, people that prevent them from reaching their full potential. So I think that's, I was fortunate towards the end of the editing process. I reached out to Haben Girma, who's a delightful person. She has a autobiography out called Haben, that's Haben. And so I bought the book, and actually I bought the audiobook, and I was listening to it on my walks. And Haben reads the book herself. And as she was reading, I thought, she sounds so nice. And so I wonder if she would read my manuscript and just give me feedback, because I certainly, a lot of what happened over 100 years ago, I wanted to be sensitive to, what is offensive today to people who are deafblind or have disabilities. And so I reached out to Haben and I said, would you read my manuscript and give me feedback? Because I really, really would value that. And she did. And so the only thing I asked her was if she would just keep me informed about where she was in the story, so that I would know what sort of episode she was going to be reading next. And so every night for about 10 days, she would send me a nightly email about how she was connecting with the story, and what was really making her angry or delighting her, or just what her reaction was. And then at the end of all of her reading, she sent me a list of just places where I could maybe make some changes, or elaborate on, or call out an ableist attitude, an attitude that an able-bodied person had that, just, could be different or better. And so she added so much just to my understanding of just people with disabilities, and it was just a wonderful blessing to me as I was working on this, that I could make the book both bring it, talk about the past, but also bring it up to the present in terms of reflecting on what people's attitudes were then, have things improved or not for people with disabilities. And so it was just a really important contribution to the book.
Yeah, and I think before we go to the Q&A, I think one thing Betsy and I have discussed is just the kind of the same old patriarchy at work. These men just coming in and trying to control Helen, trying to take over her life, trying to manipulate her, and the women in the book trying to do other things for and with Helen. I mean, there's just a lot of very complex and, in some cases, nefarious struggles in this book that keep you on the edge, like, oh, whoa, what's coming next? And, prejudices against even Ed among many of these people. I mean, it's just fascinating. It's a really fascinating read about a period in time. And as Betsy says, that unfortunately, some of these things still resonate today. So I don't know. What do you think, Betsy? Should we?
Well, let me read the, so this is the letter that I alluded to in the beginning. This is just an excerpt that I found that really piqued my interest. And this is the letter Helen wrote when she heard that Ed Chamberlin had passed away the day before. And she wrote to his widow, who was his third wife at the time. He had been widowed 2 times before. So Helen writes, "Dear Aunt Jenny, I received with tender sorrow up here in the Catskills the telegram with the news of dear Uncle Ed's death. When I last saw him, so brave and interested in everything, I could not think that he would leave us so soon. If I could take you and the others who loved him in my arms, you would feel the sympathy no words can utter. I realize that there can be no consolation for the loss of one whose life was a part of your own, but affection will speak. This affection my teacher and I have had for Uncle Ed during many years. We remember how he always understood and appreciated us both. The tears come as I think how bound up he is with the fateful experience of our lives." So that's just the beginning of the letter, and it goes on and obviously will be found in the book. But when I read that, I thought, okay, this wasn't just a little girl going sledding at the Chamberlins' house. There was more to this friendship, and it just really caused me, led me down this path, and it rewarded me in so many ways. And I think that it will reward so many others. And I'm really excited to share it.
Great.
Thank you. Hi, Sam.
Hello, and thank you, Elizabeth Emerson, Carol Henderson. We're going to do some questions. We're going to take some questions now. So if you have them, drop them in the chat or into the Q&A. And again, forgive me if my audio is distorting at all. We're having a little problem with that tonight, but I am going to read off some questions for Betsy to answer, and we do have some good ones. First one up, are there recordings of either Helen's speeches or of Helen Keller speaking at all?
There are. I don't have them. And every so often, I think sort of on the internet, one will come up. I think the place to direct that question would be the American Foundation for the Blind. I think they do have in their archive, which is just huge, they have reels. It really, I mean, she wanted to speak, and she wanted to speak very clearly, but I think it was was frequently difficult for people to understand her. So, but I think there are a few that exist, and I think the Foundation for the Blind probably has them in their archive.
And I'll drop a link in the chat in just a moment to the American Foundation for the Blind. Another question, who was it who saved the letters between Ed Chamberlin and Helen Keller so that you were able to access them? Where did these come from, and how did they get into the libraries or the Foundation's archives?
So all of Helen's personal papers, or those that survived, they had several like house fires. So I imagine that some materials were lost over time, but all of her personal papers are housed at the American Foundation for the Blind. The Ed Chamberlin letters, there were a few that were in, I guess, that my family had, that various relatives of mine had, not a lot, but then, Ed wrote letters to other people, Alexander Graham Bell, just different archives. So many of the writers and artists who congregated at Red Farm also have archives. Just as an example, a woman named Louise Guiney has an archives at Holy Cross College. And so it was just a process of, sort of figuring out where letters might exist. Obviously the Helen Keller ones were easier to find than the Ed Chamberlin letters. But again, sometimes they wrote about each other in newspaper articles and magazines. So they weren't letters necessarily, but they were, articles.
So Annie had also graduated from Perkins before Helen went. The question is, did they train the teachers at Perkins for the deafblind as well as teaching deafblind students? And did you learn anything about that process?
Well, so specifically, Annie Sullivan, she graduated from Perkins. I mean, her life story is very sad. I mean, she was an orphan and was at institutionalized at Tewksbury Almshouse, and then was sort of rescued from there and went to Perkins School. And so when she graduated, she didn't necessarily have a career. She was also having a lot of problems with her eyes. And so when the Kellers contacted the Perkins institution looking for a teacher for Helen, Annie Sullivan didn't really have any other prospects. And so she took the job, and then knowing that she was going to be teaching, she spent time with Laura Bridgman, who was at that time at Perkins, and received additional training. So I don't think necessarily that you became a teacher when you left there. And I don't know, the Perkins folks, I'm sure, would be able to answer much better what percentage of people became teachers. But in Annie's case, she knew she was going to be going to work with Helen, and so she sought some additional training, and so that she could be prepared to teach Helen.
Thank you. And if anyone does have, we're getting to the end of our hour here, but we do have a couple of minutes. So if anyone has additional questions, do feel free to drop them in the chat or into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. What is next for you? Betsy, is there a different story that you're looking at telling now? Are you going to keep exploring this? Is there a new project in the works?
Oh, that's a lovely question. I think about that a lot. There were a lot of things that had to be cut from this story just because of, publishing limitations. And so sometimes I think, oh my gosh, I could just, I would love to be going back to the New York Public Library and doing more research on Ed. So I don't know, I feel like I'll just sort of see I'm going to let things incubate for a little bit. And then, as Carol mentioned, I had been working on a memoir before I started on this project that I thought actually would be my first book. And it sometimes calls me. In 1988, I moved to Ireland for a year and I had a baby there. And that experience was what I was writing about, that and that experience. And but I feel like I haven't really fully decided what to do with that yet. So I always sort of have something. And then just, like small, like writing short stories, that's always fun. And I just I like to see what lands kind of, and where life takes me. So I don't have anything really specific yet, but that's a good question.
We always wanted to as stuff landed in her lap, or these synchronous moments would happen between people where she would suddenly just go down some rabbit hole or not, and just and letters and people showed up and all of this. We said, Betsy, you need to write a book about the writing of this book, because it's really, I mean, just as a research project, it was so fascinating how it all unfolded and grew. And so some of us in the group are wanting that, like, sort of story behind the story here. That she's going to do what she's going to do, but we all really think she's got a lot of story there too.
Possible. Yep.
Well, on that subject, and without giving anything away you might want to use later, but you said you had to leave a lot of stories kind of on the cutting room floor. Was there something that you wish could have been included in the book that you thought was a really interesting story?
I didn't. It was really, UMass Press was great. They edited very lightly. It was up to me really to shorten letters, summarize letters, because these people just wrote and wrote and wrote and enjoyed their writing. And so sometimes, I think, but I mean, I was able to keep, I think, everything that really, really mattered. I finally, when I had this word limit I was supposed to reach, or word count, and I just couldn't get there. And I thought, if I start cutting anything else, it's going to be a different book. And so I went back to my editor, Brian Halley, and I said, I think I'm done. I'm sorry, but I don't think I can do anymore. And he was kind and agreed. And, you start picking away at a word here and a word there, it's not going to help you that much in, achieving 20,000 fewer words. So they were great about accepting it. And I don't know, I think Carol's right. Some of the stories of how I found information added, so much, and were just really amazing. I got contacted by a couple that they're writing a biography of Ed's office mate in New York City. And because of that, they were going to these obscure archives and finding information for me about Ed Chamberlin. And so that was just, like incredible to from the universe be contacted by these two people. And that just became a wonderful friendship too. So I felt so fortunate, not only to inherit this story from Ed Chamberlin, but also just to find so much material. And I really feel like Helen and Ed, they wanted this story told. I feel like, that there were so many signs that this was supposed to happen. Somebody gave me one of Ed's books, and when I opened it up, it had his wife's calling card in it. And, it's just like, this book was supposed to come to me. And so things like that, we get sentimental about research, I guess. But, just the all the little bits and stories, and just, the fact that Helen and Ed had such a rich friendship it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Thank you so much. This has been just fascinating to learn about and to listen to for me. And we've got a couple of great comments from folks in the chat. Sue says, this is wildly intriguing. And Olivia as well in the Q&A says, thank you, this was really fascinating. So we are hooked. We can't wait to hear more. And if you would like to learn more, the book is Letters from Red Farm. It is just out just in the last couple of weeks from UMass Press, University of Massachusetts. And we have copies. We actually have signed copies. I neglected to mention, but Betsy was kind enough to sign our stock. So limited signed copies while they last at the Norwich Bookstore. You can order online. Link is in the chat, or pick one up on our website, norwichbookstore.com. You can pick one up in the store if you're here in the area, and we would love to see you. Betsy Emerson, thank you so much. Carol Henderson, it's such a pleasure listening to both of you talk and learning more about this story. We're so excited to see where it goes next. Thank you so much to everyone. If you were having trouble hearing me this evening, I sincerely apologize. Thank you for bearing with us. And thank you for your support of the Norwich Bookstore. We are so grateful for it. It is what keeps us going through all kinds of times, including these strange ones we live in now. Wherever you are tonight, thank you for joining us. Read good books, be well, take care of each other. We're all in this together. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.